I've seen several members of the community criticize the new Hero Spec talent trees for the War Within as not being very interesting. I've disagreed with that thus far, but I think this might be the spec that finally makes me see their point. Herald of the Sun Paladin is pretty simple, but does that mean it's actually bad? Hi, it's Llarold, and I'm going to cover the new Herald of the Sun Hero Spec for Retribution and Holy Paladins, but before I do, we've added memberships to our channel. So if you want to support us on our journey as we continue making more content heading into the War Within and beyond, that would be amazing. On a basic level, every healer wants to do more healing, and every DPS spec wants to deal more damage. This talent tree adds both damage and healing, and that's a good thing, sort of. The issue here is that, on some level by playing a Paladin, you're clearly opting into more than just pure throughput. For protection, you get that in the form of a ton of group defensive cooldowns and healing. For Holy, you get that from the ability to consistently deal damage while healing, and for Ret, you get some mixture of external defensive cooldowns and maybe some party healing too. And for all of those specs, you get a pretty good amount of crowd control. Does this tree offer any of that kind of utility? A little bit, but mostly this tree just gives hots and dots. Now let's take a look at it. Here we have the Herald of the Sun, Holy and Retribution Paladin talent tree, and the top talent is Sunspot. This is sort of the guiding principle of the whole tree. When you use Holy Prism as Holy, or Wake of Ashes as Retribution, basically you use sort of your short cooldown, 20 seconds for Holy Prism and 30 for Wake of Ashes. When you use that, you get the ability to apply a damage over time or healing over time effect called a Sunspot. Sunspots do some amount of damage or healing, we don't know exactly how much, and they last for 8 seconds. They're applied by your next 2 holy power spenders, and what we don't know is whether they're single target, they're applied to the primary target of your attacks, or if they can be applied by AoEs. So in the case of Ret Pally, I'll just show off here, obviously Divine Storm, it hits multiple targets. So would a Divine Storm that hits 5 targets apply a Sunspot to all 5 of them? Or would it only apply to the one that you're targeting? And the same question stands for Light of Dawn. Would that apply a Sunspot to all 5 targets that you're able to hit with it? Or would it just apply to one target chosen randomly? There's really no way to know for sure. In addition to that, Sunspots also radiate out damage and healing based on, well, how much damage or healing they're doing, but it seems like it's a pretty small amount, only 10% of that and reduced beyond 5 targets. So very small amount of AoE damage or healing coming out of that Sunspot. Now the next talent here is Morningstar and Gleaming Rays. It's a choice node. Morningstar makes it so that your next Sunspot will stack up to dealing more damage over time, and that is a bonus that stacks faster while you're out of combat. No, we don't know for sure if this is the kind of thing, and I kind of hope it is just to save players from themselves, but if this is the kind of thing that resets when you pull a raid boss, any situation where you have to have a 20+ second pull timer is kind of painful. So honestly, even though it's kind of annoying to have buffs wiped on pull, it's almost sort of a blessing in disguise to just not have to deal with that. Gleaming Rays, by comparison, just makes it so that when you have a Sunspot active, your Holy Power spenders deal 10% more damage and healing. Now, Holy Power spenders, it kind of makes sense, right? Those are the main sources of damage and healing. They're kind of your biggest skills. So since it seems like you can have a Sunspot active a pretty good amount of time, this actually might wind up just being the better talent and also kind of simpler. Another thing that's not really clear about the Sunspots is if you're, it applies to the next 2 Holy Power spenders after you cast Wake of Ashes. So let's just hit Wake of Ashes and then throw out a Divine Storm and a Final Verdict. Would that apply 2 Sunspots to the target? Would it overwrite them? Would they overlap like a Druid's Iron Fur, where one is up for 8 seconds, then a couple seconds later another one's applied, and you have 2 stacks rolling for the next 5 or 6 seconds, and then the first stack will fall off, and then a few seconds later the second stack falls off? None of that's super clear. They haven't made that clear. It's something that'll have to be tested. I kind of hope it works that way, because the alternatives are either that it doesn't stack at all, which would be really bad, or that it stacks and refreshes the duration, which would mean you would want to apply the first Sunspot as quickly as possible after casting Wake of Ashes or Holy Prism, and then you would want to wait like 6 or 7 seconds to roll that out to a 2 stack for another full 8 seconds. That seems very irritating, to not spend any of your Holy Power in that intervening window. That just sounds kind of terrible. So I would hope it wouldn't work that way. And because it probably would just work in a way where you're rolling these out as quickly as you can, Gleaming Rays does seem like you might actually lose some value. It encourages trying to stagger them out, which seems like not really all that fun of a play style. Eternal Flame is very simple. This is actually an old talent that was introduced all the way back in Mists of Pandaria, been reworked a bit here. Basically, it just makes your Word of Glory, at least the way it worked in the past, and the way it seems like it works now, is just instead of Word of Glory being a direct heal, it's still a direct heal, but then it also has a heal over time component that deals probably pretty close to the same amount of the full base heal as a heal over time as well that lasts for 20 seconds, and it heals you for more if you cast it on yourself. This is fine. This sort of just plays into this whole concept of this being a heal over time and damage over time based spec. Luminosity makes it so that you just get increased crit chance on your primary single target generator. Holy Shock and Hammer of Wrath really isn't the primary one, but it's one of the more important holy power generators for Ret. It is the only one that is purely single target, even with talents, so that's fine. And then it's your AoE holy power spender, so Light of Dawn and Divine Storm. Those all get increased crit chance. Illumine makes it so that sunspots reduce the move speed of enemies by 50%, which is actually a pretty substantial amount of slow. And so if this winds up being more of the playstyle where you are trying to stagger out your sunspots, like you're able to roll them out as long as you can, that could actually wind up being pretty heavy coverage of that slow. I mean, for a Holy Paladin, assuming you were playing for the absolute maximum uptime on sunspots, you could get 16 seconds out of every 20. That's 80% uptime. For Ret, it's more like 16 seconds out of every 27, so that's still over 15%, over 50% uptime. That's still pretty good. And then getting increased move speed on allies by 20%, that's okay. I mean, I wouldn't say no to having a Holy Paladin around if that meant that I was going to have 20% more move speed all the time. You know, when you compare that to, say, the Monk talent tree, Windwalking, which is an insanely expensive talent, is worth 4% move speed, and it's 2 points, and it's buried in a really awful spot in the tree. So, like, getting over 50% uptime on 20% move speed sounds pretty great by comparison. Will of the Dawn is a much more selfish type of talent. It's just 5% more move speed for yourself when you're above 80% health, which, honestly, that's not too bad. And when your health is brought below 35%, you get 40% move speed for 5 seconds, but that's on a 1-minute cooldown. This seems very good for PvP. It seems like it would be almost impossible to catch and kill a Holy Paladin in PvP anytime you finally do get them low. After all of their defensive cooldowns and all their instant heals, they're then able to just sort of sprint away and get to safety and heal themselves back up. That seems like it's going to cause a lot of headaches for PvPers. I also think this is actually pretty good for PvE content as well, though, because when your health is brought low, you're usually in the process of trying to dodge something or get out of some sort of mechanic, and getting a sudden 40% move speed burst when you are trying to run from things is good. So I think this could actually be a pretty good talent option in dangerous PvE situations, but the application for PvP is just so insanely strong. Very, very obviously good. Eternal Sun and Lingering Radiance are another choice note here. Eternal Sun just makes it so that sunspots last for another 2 seconds, and Eternal Flame lasts for another 3. This sort of seems like a bit of a no-brainer for Holy, especially if the goal of staggering out the sunspots is to make them kind of last as long as possible. Now, instead of 8 seconds, you get 10. Holy Prism's still a 20-second cooldown, so we're talking full uptime on sunspots, potentially. That seems really, really good. The alternative is Lingering Radiance, which makes sunspots leave an Eternal Flame for 12 seconds on allies or a Greater Judgment on enemies when they expire or are extended. Now, Greater Judgment, that is this talent here, 20% increased damage from your next Holy Power ability. It's a pretty good amount of damage. The problem is it doesn't seem like it casts a Greater Judgment, like it doesn't do the damage of a judgment. It just gives you 20% more damage on your next Templar's Verdict, or if you're playing Holy, I guess Shield of the Righteous. Not really that appealing for Holy, I think. The free Eternal Flame might be, but that would require pretty high tuning on Eternal Flame, and I don't really expect that to be the case. I think Eternal Sun is just clearly a superior talent here. It has a lot better synergy with the rest of the tree as well, compared to just getting some free judgment buffs and some eternal flame buff application. Sunseer makes it so that your Holy Shock and Light of Dawn or your Hammer of Wrath and Divine Storm, those same skills that were buffed by Luminosity to have increased crit chance, it makes it so that when they crit, they do damage over time, or healing over time if that's relevant. This is good. This is just another damage multiplier on top of a damage multiplier, and that is the kind of mechanic that you like to see. It's very simple, but it adds a lot of damage or throughput of some sort, maybe healing, which is good. Aurora makes it so that after you cast Holy Prism or Wake of Ashes, you gain Divine Purpose. Divine Purpose is one of my favorite talents in the game. It's sadly pretty underused. You basically don't use it as Ret or Prot anymore. I have figured out the absolute basics of Holy Paladin talents, and it is in use for Holy Paladin, and that is like the one thing about the Holy Paladin that I really find appealing. They get to actually make use of Divine Purpose. I love and miss Divine Purpose being a strong, relevant talent. It has kind of fallen into disuse deep into dragonflight, and that's fine. I mean, both Ret and Prot are in amazing shape right now, but certainly having some sort of Divine Purpose coming back is good, and having it come back on the back of using Wake of Ashes or Holy Prism, where you have this immediate incentive. You know, you cast one of those, you get your Sunspot buff, and then also you have now this, you've generated the holy power to cast one of your holy power skills, and you also have a free one, so you can very easily consume both of those sunspots and get that damage out as quickly as you can. I think that's really great. It really does make a lot of sense there. Solar Grace makes it so that you get a very modest haste buff each time you apply a sunspot, and unlike with the sunspots where things are kind of unclear, this is very clear. Multiple stacks can overlap, so unlike the sunspots, potentially, you have this very clear incentive as soon as you have generated those two sunspots to consume them, get yourself an 8% buff rolling for the next like 11 seconds, and yeah, that is exactly what you want. Second Sunrise makes it so that, once again, the Holy Shock and Light of Dawn, if you're Holy, or Hammer of Wrath and Divine Storm, if you're Ret, have a chance to cast a second time for 30% effectiveness. Now, this is an interesting idea. This is sort of like another way to crit. It's kind of bringing back multi-strike, which this isn't the only thing in the tree that's bringing back a lot of Warlords of Draenor vibes. Eternal Flame really reminds me of Prot in Warlords of Draenor, because that was such a nice talent back in that particular era of the class. The problem here is that the tuning on this is a little underwhelming. Like if we say a 15% chance to cast a second time at 30% effectiveness, 0.3 times 0.15 is only about 4.5%. So that is basically 4.5% more damage for Hammer of Wrath and Divine Storm. Not total damage for the class. It's, you know, less than 5% damage just on those two skills. Is that a good bonus? I mean, it's not nothing. It is damage, but it's a very small amount of damage. We're talking maybe 1% more total damage, or maybe 2 in AoE, and the same kind of goes for healing. It's a pretty small bonus to your overall damage and healing, which really isn't all that impressive. Finally, we have Sun's Avatar. During Avenging Wrath, you become linked to your sunspots. You basically get like a chain between you and your sunspots, and that causes radiant damage to enemies or healing to allies that are in between those beams, so you kind of have an incentive to move around a bit and force enemies to be between you and the sunspots, and that'll do less damage or healing once you've gone above 5 targets. Pretty normal design there. Activating Avenging Wrath will automatically throw 4 sunspots onto nearby allies or enemies and increase their damage and healing by 20%. Now, yet another thing that's kind of unclear here is whether this will apply all the sunspots. Let's say you're Ret and you're in single target and you pop wings. Is this going to throw all 4 sunspots into the target that you're fighting? You know, is it going to just throw 4 sunspots onto that one guy? Is it going to throw 1 sunspot onto them and 3 onto nearby allies? It's unclear how that'll work, and obviously those particular aspects of that design are going to be essential for determining whether this talent tree is basically good or bad at all. With Ret having a 1-minute cooldown on Avenging Wrath, if this talent tree is able to freely throw 4 sunspots into a raid boss, single target boss every minute, and the sunspots are tuned to do a pretty reasonable amount of damage, and then you're also getting sunspots every time you cast Wake of Ashes, this could actually wind up being a better talent setup than Templar, even though Templar looks like it's absolutely insane. Templar summoning like 50 plus hammers a minute, giving you this extra damage cooldown on top of Wake of Ashes, all very appealing. But there's a real possibility that with the way that this talent tree is tuned and designed, it could just wind up being better. It's entirely dependent on the tuning and whether or not you're able to stack the sunspots onto targets and whether you're able to roll them, extending the duration, or if they just sort of overlap, or if they just completely overwrite each other. And there's not enough information here in this write-up. They kind of gave us an incomplete product here. We can look at this and see it does damage, but also there's some damage, and then there's some healing, and then damage. There's some utility, and then more damage, and damage, and damage, and damage. That's good, but not knowing any of the numbers, not knowing really most of the mechanics of how it works, this is kind of an incomplete tree, and it is mechanically pretty uninteresting. I think it's nice and simple, so it is certainly an easy tree to wrap your head around. You do a lot of damage with it. That's kind of what it does. I like that aspect of it, but it is a little underwhelming mechanically. There's just really not that much going on here. I think the only really interesting mechanical interactions here are the Solar Grace and Aurora interacting with Sunspot and the free holy power, or the 3 holy power that you get from casting Wake of Ashes, allowing you to cast Wake of Ashes and then immediately double tap Spenders and get that Solar Grace stacked up multiple times. I think getting a big burst of haste basically every time you cast Wake of Ashes, I think that's pretty interesting, and it has some really good burst damage potential. That could wind up being really good. This is a talent tree that I am interested to get into the beta with and play around and just kind of see how it handles. I could be pleasantly surprised here, but I have to say the initial pass, the initial bit of information, sort of a shortage of information that they gave with it, it's not as inspiring as some of the alternatives that we've seen. I think both Lightsmith for Holy and Templar for Retribution are a lot more interesting than Herald of the Sun. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.